Great. Well, thanks for having me and great to be back sort of virtually. So I think the title of this talk was sort of Introduction to Online Experiments, period. That's a huge topic, which I'm not going to be able to cover. So rather, it's going to be focused on using Facebook for online experiments and more broadly sort of online recruitment of respondents, even for sort of basic surveys. So I'm going to divide our session into sort of two parts. The first part, I'll talk about using Facebook ads to recruit respondents and give a couple examples from my own work. Then I'll sort of do a deeper dive into the paper that we shared with the link for this session about recruiting sort of more diverse samples using quota-based sampling and Facebook ads. And then in the second part, I'm hoping that we can sort of have much more of a working session in terms of getting into the nitty-gritty of how to set up Facebook ads, everything from the ad creative, how you do your targeting, how you optimize for conversions or your sort of outcome of interest. And we can talk through some sort of frequently asked questions. Some of you sent me some questions ahead of time, so that was great. And feel free to interrupt me at any point with a question or comment, or feel free to drop it in the chat, which I can see. So to start, just run through some quick examples from my own work in terms of like giving you a sense of sort of the broad ways in which you can use Facebook for recruitment. So the first actually way that I used Facebook was back in 2015. And here we did a sort of online field experiment. So this was partnered with an organization called Mzalendo in Kenya. And here we were interested in sort of A/B testing a website, or, as we would sort of call it as social scientists, testing a framing experiment. So what it looks like is, people saw this ad on Facebook, and we targeted Kenyans on Facebook 18 and over. We had 4 different ads targeting these 2 different age groups, and then men and women. So it was crossed across these 2 subgroups. And so once people clicked on the ad, they were sent to one of these 2 website looks. So it was, the same video of an MP talking about an unemployment bill he was sponsoring in Parliament. But either it was framed as sort of targeting youth in particular, or just talking about unemployment more generally. And this was, related to the research questions the partner had at the time. And so here it was not at all sort of trying to get people to take a survey, but rather this online field experiment to see how these different kinds of framings mattered in terms of getting people to comment below. There was a sort of add your comment to the website, sharing the link to the website on Facebook, reading the actual bill in Parliament, and sharing on Twitter. So what I want to highlight here is that through these ads and a budget of about $3,000, we got 31,000 unique visitors to this website, which we were able to track. And in sort of part 2, we'll walk through how you track people. So a very cheap 10-cent cost per click. But then, of course, as we can all imagine, of these 30,000-ish people, a much smaller subset actually took any kind of action on the page, which is not surprising. So this is sort of one way that you could design a field experiment online. If you had, different kinds of framings that you wanted to test, you could create a website, and there's a bunch of ways to easily sort of randomize URLs to get the A or B version of a website. So this is sort of the one that's slightly different than the rest of the studies I'll talk about. So the second is a paper that recently was published in Comparative Political Studies with Young Zhou. So we, took out similar Facebook ads targeting Kenyans and Tanzanians on Facebook. We had a sort of targeting strategy that was both countrywide, but then we also tried some sort of more location-specific strategies. So this was a project looking at how national sports team wins, in particular soccer team wins, influence both nationalism and national pride, but also attitudes towards refugees. So given that interest, we initially thought about targeting Tanzanians and Kenyans living near refugee camps in the country. And I can talk about more later, but this actually didn't work out as well as we had hoped, which is one of the challenges with Facebook ads, is that you can target very specific subgroups and locations of interest, but given the numbers of people that happen to be on the platform in those locations, it can, one, be quite expensive, And two, you can actually, fail to get a significant number of people in these particular locations. So we sort of abandoned this location-based strategy after a little while and focused on the countrywide strategy because we had a sort of natural experiment or a difference in differences design, but also survey prime. So we were more focused on internal validity rather than getting a more representative or diverse sample. So we spent about $2,000. We got just over 2,600 respondents. Our average cost was more expensive than the last one. And actually, I think this is my most expensive cost per completed survey. And that, we can guess as to why that might be. One of the things I'll talk about later is that the Facebook ad platform is a marketplace, right? It's an auction and bidding system. So depending on the time of the year, around the holidays, I can imagine things are more expensive because people are trying to send out a lot of ads to get people to buy things. So that is sort of one of the things to consider when you're thinking about taking out these ads and also trying to estimate the costs that you'll likely incur. So I will also mention that this study was a panel. So we recruited respondents over 15 days of showing our ads. But then once they sort of consented to the survey and once they clicked on the ad, they were taken to a Qualtrics survey. They also got asked if they were interested in taking an end line. So we paid people about 50 cents for the baseline survey completion and then $1 because we wanted people to also take the end line a couple weeks later. And here we conducted the survey in both English and Swahili. So this is a table from the appendix of the paper where we provide the descriptive statistics of the sample. And as you can see, not at all nationally representative. I want to be clear up front, in most country contexts, Facebook will not get you a nationally representative sample, which makes sense, right? Because, people have to be online, they have to have access to the internet and at least a phone. People who select into taking a survey, have to read the consent, depending on what language you're doing it in. All of these things are going to determine what kind of sort of selection bias you have. But at the same time, I will say that, the reviewers we got for this study were very understanding, and, it was not our main goal to get a nationally representative sample. Rather, we were focused on internal validity. So I think, I think reviewers asked for this table just to understand how our sample compares to other samples like the Afrobarometer. But, it's not necessary to have a diverse or nationally representative sample in many of the research questions we're interested in. So this is a project that's currently a working paper with Adam Berinsky, who I'm sure you all know, and then David Rand, who's also at Sloan at MIT, and Ben Spago, who's at Toulouse. And again, we were taking out ads, sending people to a Qualtrics survey. Here, also for the previous study, we created our own Facebook page. Right? So it wasn't with a partner, we created our own page from which we took out the ads. Here we're targeting Nigerians on Facebook, 18 and over. We just had 2 ads for men and women. We spent about $200, got about 3,000 clicks, which turned into about 1,300 completed surveys. And similarly, even when we were trying to separate the ads for men and women to try and achieve sort of more balance, because often, at least in my experience in the countries that I've targeted with Facebook, I almost always get more men clicking and more men taking the survey than women. So often what you can do is sort of take out these 2 ads and turn off the male ad more quickly and have the one targeting women keep running. In this case, we did a little bit of that, but even so, we had so many men at the beginning that we couldn't achieve balance, which again was okay for our purposes for this study. And here we got about 15 cents per survey, and we were paying a good price. I think this is the most I've paid for about a 20-minute survey. So it filled quite quickly. So this took 2 days to get over 1,000 respondents. And finally, the last study that I'll give a quick overview of is one that we recently completed. And in contrast to the other studies where the Facebook ad takes users who click on it to a Qualtrics link, this one keeps people in the Facebook platform and uses the Facebook Messenger chatbot to actually conduct the survey. And so this is something that we can talk about later. in terms of understanding when Qualtrics versus a messenger delivery of the survey might be better or worse. So here we were targeting Nigerians and Kenyans on Facebook to understand how to combat the infodemic and stop the spread of coronavirus misinformation. So we spent about $1,000, got about 16,000 messages started in the Messenger app, and that translated into almost 10,000 completed surveys. So a cost of about 11 cents per survey. Again, we were incentivizing people, sending people airtime of equivalent to 50 cents after they completed the survey. And again, our targets were sort of above and below the mean age in each of these countries, both for men and women. We were able to achieve much better balance on gender. But it turned out to be still quite difficult to get older people to take the survey, and it becomes more expensive sort of to target older people. So we ended up sort of not achieving as great balance on age as we had hoped. So for those of you who might not be familiar with what a chatbot version of a survey looks like, this is a quick video of it. So people who clicked on our ad on the left would be taken to the Messenger app or window in Facebook. And here it's quite similar to how you would program a Qualtrics survey. We use Chatfuel, but there's a bunch of other programs out there so that you don't have to sort of hard code these chatbots. You can use a user interface that's more friendly to put in both, stimuli with images, questions with text. Then people have buttons, yes or no, that you can click. This is me doing it on the computer, so that's why you see the mouse, but most of our respondents were taking it on their phone, and you can test that as well. So before I go into a deeper dive into sort of this methods paper, are there any questions or comments so far? Okay. So this is a paper with a bunch of co-authors. Some of the names might be familiar. Other political scientists, another demographer, and also an information systems engineer. And so here we're interested in digging in a little bit deeper to understand how the kinds of quality and quantity trade-offs that we might make when using Facebook for recruitment. And here we're going to test this in Kenya and Mexico. So the motivation, I probably don't have to go into too much detail for any of you already here, but 67% of the world's population has a mobile phone subscription, 49% has access to the internet, online service can be fast and affordable, but our question is, can they lead to quality results? And so in the past, if you're a comparativist, you often would spend lots of time in the field conducting face-to-face surveys, hiring respondents. This is quite time and cost intensive. And by no means am I suggesting that Facebook surveys are going to replace fieldwork. They absolutely should not. Rather, we want to highlight that this can provide an opportunity, given the number of people that are online, to complement traditional on-the-ground fieldwork and data collection. So why Facebook in particular? Well, it has 2.5 billion monthly active users. And there's a lot of micro targeting benefits that you can get from using this platform. Other social science scholars have targeted migrants and refugees, for instance, created panels with different kinds of respondents, looked at COVID-19 behavior. There's almost any study about anything in any context that has a lot of Facebook users that you could find now, both by demographers, political scientists, economists, a lot of different kinds of researchers. So our specific research question was, can quota sampling using Facebook advertisements deliver quality results? And I'll talk about what I mean by quality in a moment. So this question has been asked by other researchers. So Zhang et al. Has done this in the United States and found pretty good results using quota-based sampling there. Boas et al. Has done it in the US and India and similarly found promising results. So we're doing this in Mexico and Kenya because we might think to lower levels of internet access, literacy in these regions that it might not be exactly clear whether we can get similar quality results in these contexts. So what do I mean by quality? So we talk about it in terms of internal validity and external validity. So first, does Facebook effectively identify respondents of interest? Meaning if we're targeting women of a certain age, is Facebook going to send our ads to women of a certain age? Second, are the responses valid? Meaning, as we're always concerned, whether it's on MTurk or something else, are respondents paying attention? Are they answering the question correctly? All of that. And so on these first two measures, we find that actually Facebook does pretty well. But in terms of external validity, right? So the first question might be, can all our subgroups of interest be reached? And actually the answer is no. Again, it sort of depends on what kinds of subgroups you're interested in, but I'll show you in a moment that we were interested in sort of geographic diversity. And there are some areas for which we just could not fill our cells because there weren't enough people to take the survey there or who were willing to take our survey in these locations. Second, are users who respond to the survey similar to those who didn't take the survey, right? So selection bias, which is a concern in any kind of research, but we wanted to know how similar our Facebook sample might be to the Facebook population or how different. And it's sort of mixed. And I think this is one case where it's going to vary depending on your context, right? So depending on how, how people usually use Facebook is sort of one question, whether it's common to see these kinds of ads for surveys or whether it appears like it's a scam. And that's something that we can talk about and I've definitely run into issues with. And then third, so we want to know, are units independently sampled, right? So if we were doing a nationally representative sample, we would want, either based on population or clustered sampling or whatever, but we would want units to have independent probabilities of being sampled, which is actually most likely not the case on Facebook for a lot of reasons. One being the algorithm that Facebook uses to send your ad to different people. Second being the fact that people can share the ad. And when the ad or the survey is actually incentivized, and particularly so if you're paying people a lot of money to take your survey, they're going to share it with their friends. So then you're going to run into issues with this assumption. Okay. So how did we do this in Mexico and Kenya? So we did this actually a little bit differently in each case, which I think speaks to the variety and breadth that you can use these ads for. So in Mexico, we created strata based on gender, age, education, and administrative unit, being municipality. We asked a bunch of demographic questions. We asked a couple opinion questions related to climate change. We had a sample size of over 5,000. In Kenya, we created strata based on gender, age, education, and the Afrobarometer cluster. So given that we couldn't adopt a sort of population-based strategy for sampling, what we did is we used the Afrobarometer GPS locations to target our ads to those locations. We asked similar demographic questions and then also political attitude questions. So this is what the sort of municipality level in Mexico looks like. So as you can imagine, there's a lot of ads to be created. In Kenya, these are the Afrobarometer GPS clusters. And I'll talk a little bit about how we implemented this. So with respect to internal validity, right, we want to know if Facebook is accurately targeting people. So when we say we want women of a certain age, are they sending the ad to those people? And then are those people who Facebook thinks they are, right? So Facebook can get some data based on what you enter in your profile, but it also has to estimate some data for whatever is not provided by the user. So in this case, what this table is showing is the percent of people for whom Facebook's tag or definition of gender, location, and age match that the respondent reported. So in Mexico, it performs better than in Kenya. So 98% of the respondents in Mexico had the same gender that Facebook estimated for them. In terms of location, I think this was municipality level, 67%, right? So this, you can imagine location is a little bit harder to estimate. People move around. And when you create your ad, you can target people by the location they live in or if they've traveled there. So depending on those things, you can imagine Facebook has a harder time estimating who actually lives or just works in a particular location. And then in terms of age, 87% in Mexico, 47% in Kenya. And I think my best guess as to why Kenya overall performs worse than in Mexico is because the survey was incentivized in Kenya, but not in Mexico. And so there's might be more of an interest in sort of sharing the survey or the ad with your friends in Kenya, who might also want 50 shillings of airtime. In which case, if you take out an ad targeting a particular age or gender, people are going to share it, and then you're going to get users from other subgroups. Also, in terms of sort of internal validity and quality checks, we had some basic attention checks. In Kenya, I think this one where 98% passed was just, asking people to restate their age and then verifying that it was the same age that they had provided in the beginning. So overall, in terms of internal validity, I think Facebook does pretty well. We also replicated the canonical Tversky and Kahneman unusual disease problem, where the results look exactly how they would in an mTurk sample, in a nationally representative sample, across many different contexts. So this is, when the problem is framed in terms of lives lost, people prefer adopting a risky policy. But when the problem of this unusual disease coming is framed in terms of lives, number of lives that will be saved, people much prefer the certain policy that will save lives. Again, this is a sort of initial gut check to make sure that respondents are behaving the way we would expect them to if they were reading the question correctly. So this is sort of a good signal. Okay, so then in terms of external validity, here what we're looking at is demographics for percent of respondents who are female, and then across 4 different age categories for Mexico and for Kenya. And so here we can think about making lots of different types of comparisons. So we're presenting data from the census in yellow, the LawPop and Afrobarometer in red. And so we can think about comparing both the census and barometer data to the Facebook population, which is in dark blue. And so here you can already see that there are some discrepancies, right? As we would imagine, the nationally representative samples are different from the Facebook population, which makes sense. We can also compare then our Facebook sample, which the unweighted Facebook sample is sort of the light blue hollow circles. And then the weighted sample, we use raking weights here in sort of the filled in light blue. And so again, we can compare both sort of our sample to the Facebook population to look at the selection bias question, and we see some discrepancies as well. And then also compare our sample to the census, which we imagined would be different, but it's more to understand how different and in what ways. And then finally understand how much can sort of post-stratification weighting ameliorate these discrepancies in the sample. And we can talk more about weighting in the Q&A if you have questions on that. Here, what we're looking at is education, which we found particularly hard to achieve sort of diverse respondents from. So as you can see in both countries, based on the census and nationally representative surveys, there's many more people with a high school degree or less than there are with post-secondary degrees. But when looking at the Facebook population and our Facebook sample, it's flipped, right? So people on Facebook tend to be sort of more educated. And then as you can see in sort of the discrepancy between the dark blue bar, the Facebook population, and our Facebook sample, there is this selection bias. So people who are taking our survey are even more educated than people in the Facebook population. So that's just something to be aware of when you're thinking about using this to recruit respondents in terms of understanding what kinds of respondents you're going to be able to reach. But with any survey, things have trade-offs, right? So all of these sort of quality concerns might be ameliorated by sort of the cost benefits that we get from using Facebook. So costs are overall low, but they are quite variable, and it depends a lot on your targeting criteria. So here we're just presenting, as we do in the paper, some of the costs in our 2 countries. And again, sort of the Mexico sample was not incentivized. And had a different targeting approach at the municipality level, whereas Kenya was incentivized and had these specific geographic locations. So I think, this $22 cost per survey was for targeting an ad in, I think, Northeast Kenya, where you can imagine it's going to be challenging to get people to take a survey. So this is all just to show that overall costs are much cheaper than they would be in an in-person or even an over the phone or sort of commercial survey firm kind of survey. but they can, approach those levels depending on the specific targeting strategy you're using. So some quick conclusions. Facebook can diversify audiences beyond mTurk and lab samples. It can be relatively cheap and quick, and it does have these rich targeting capabilities. But this comes with costs, so some strata cannot be filled and are actually quite expensive to reach certain populations. The targeting accuracy is mixed. So this is why it's also important to just ask people for the demographic variables that you care most about and not rely on the Facebook ad demographics that they say they can estimate for users. And then there is this selection bias problem with respect to the national and the Facebook population. So again, in terms of like your research question, if you're particularly concerned with internal validity, you have a survey experiment you want to run, this is not necessarily very problematic. It's just to realize and to be transparent upfront about what the limitations of your sample might be. And finally, I'll say the platform is not designed with researchers in mind. So there's a lot of sort of quirks of the platform that are not necessarily problematic, but can be challenging. So for instance, if you're trying to take out a lot of ads, it's not very easy if you're trying to monitor quotas and add targets. It's getting a little bit better, and there are some ways now to automate it, but it to date has been a very manual process and sort of requires a lot of babysitting of these ads and quotas. But that's just something that will probably get better with time. So let me pause there before we move to part 2 and see if there are any questions. Okay. Guess I will just jump right in. So this is going to be very much a sort of follow along if you have a Facebook account and want to sort of try setting up some ads as we go. So please jump in and, speak up if something doesn't make sense. I'm not going to do it live just because screening purposes. There's a bunch of sort of IDs that are on the Facebook page. So I have a bunch of screenshots to show you all, but hopefully that's clear. And if anything's not clear, let me know. Yeah.
Actually, sorry, I have a really quick clarification question. Did you see that the rates for targeting like specific demographics are like the rates differ? And is that because of the makeup on Facebook? So if there are like groups that are smaller, do they charge more for targeting those groups, or how does that work?
So I know less about how it actually works on Facebook and more about like in practice what the cost ends up being. So it's a bidding system or an auction system on Facebook. So I think, what that generally means is if there's particular groups that everyone wants to advertise to for whatever reason, if it's like, most young women in a particular country are online shoppers, and so we're, anyone selling anything online is trying to target those people, then creating an ad and targeting that group is going to be expensive. But I think it's also the case that if you're trying to target a group for whom there's not a lot of Facebook users online, so in Northeast Kenya, where we found, one is to note that Facebook will actually not let you target a group that has less than 1,000 users. So for instance, if you put in a GPS location and said, I want, anyone in this, 10-mile radius who's a Facebook user, and if there's fewer than 1,000 users in that area, Facebook will not let you target there. So you'd have to like enlarge in the circle around that location or create another location as well. But I think in my experience, at least, if you have fewer people, it's also going to be more expensive to get those people.
Yeah. Do you know the reason behind that policy, like them not allowing you to target smaller groups?
I'm pretty sure it's for privacy concerns.
Okay.
So, you know, if there's 10 people, 10 users in a particular area, I get them to take a survey, I can probably figure out who they are.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. So I think the first question, and probably this is pretty obvious, but you know, is to ask, is Facebook right for this project? And so secondly, can I reach the people I want in an affordable way? So obviously this depends on your question of interest, your target population. So for instance, if you're thinking about running some kind of study on the nomadic people of wherever, this is probably not the best way to reach those people. Similarly, you know, again, obvious, but people are self-administering any kind of survey. So there has to be a decent rate of literacy among your target population. Secondly, and perhaps sort of less obvious, is that there are sometimes country level regulations, whether that's a social media tax like in Uganda, or Facebook is restricted in some countries, that make Facebook a suboptimal tool for recruitment. So something to just be aware of as well. And then you want to make sure that your target group is accessible. And one way to do this is using the audience estimates and the Facebook API. So if you go to that link, you should see something like this, where you can enter your country of interest or a sublocation of interest, a state in Nigeria, a state in the US, and then Facebook will give you an estimate of how many people, how many users sort of fit your criteria based on location, age, gender. In the US, you can also get use different kinds of interests, for instance, sort of political leaning, though I don't know if they've stopped that now, different connections to different kinds of Facebook pages, and it'll give you an estimate in terms of the distribution across age and gender, even relationship status, education levels. So this is one quick way to see sort of like how many people are on Facebook in the place of the types of subgroups that you care about. So from that page, there should be on the sort of top right, a click to create an ad, a button to click to create an ad. And I'll walk you through how to set up an ad quickly, but feel free to also play around. So the first step is to create or select the Facebook page you want to send ads from. And in my experience, this doesn't matter so much. I think the look and feel of the ads and the sort of experience in the survey and the incentive, if there is one, matter a lot more than the actual Facebook page. But having said that, you do need a Facebook page. And it has to look legit because otherwise you'll get, you know, concerns of people thinking it's a scam. So often what I do is I'll create a Facebook page much before I aim to run the survey and, you know, ask friends to like it, start posting things about, you know, information like we're researchers looking to get opinions on XYZ broadly, to just make it a little bit more informative so that if someone does go to your page from the ad, they have a bit more information. Please stop me at any time if you have a question. Yes.
Just a quick question. On some of the pages, I noticed that it says like MIT or Princeton and a university name, and on others it doesn't. Yeah. Could you talk about like the decision that you made to name it, and whether or not do you have to like get permission from the university to do that?
So I think you do. I did not on the MIT Princeton one, but on the Social Impact Research Initiative one, so that was created for my current lab before I joined, and I think they did want to use the Stanford name, but then we're not allowed to. So it's a bit of a tricky thing. I think if you ask, you are going to be told that you cannot use the name, and you probably should ask. So then I think it's just, I think I have another page that's like academic research in Africa or something like that. So I think it helps to have a name that's sort of obvious as to what it is, like that you're an academic institution, that you're doing research. But I honestly don't know how much the sort of label of the institution matters. It probably does lend some credibility, but I don't think it's going to hurt you that much if you can't use the name. Okay, so then the second step is you decide how many ads and ad sets you want to run. So this question, or the answer to this question, is based on, are there variables that you want to achieve balance on, or at least sort of get a more diverse sample? So often that could be gender or age, location, things like that. And I should say that this is the way that ads are structured. So there's a campaign level first. Then you can have multiple ad sets within a single campaign, and then multiple ads within ad sets within a campaign. And we'll talk about that in a second. So for each ad set, you can target a different audience. So if I wanted a campaign, if I was running a new study and I created a new campaign, then I might have different ad sets, one for men, one for women, things like that. You can also set a different budget and timeline for each ad set. So if I thought, or did a pilot and estimated that targeting women was going to be more expensive than targeting men, maybe my ad set for women would have a higher daily budget than my ad set for men. And this is important. So there are a couple of ways you can set a budget on Facebook, and you want to ignore everything else, and you just want to set a daily budget. I cannot tell you exactly why, but I can tell you that I've talked to people at Facebook who also recommend this, and similarly can't tell you exactly why, but this is how you want to structure your budget. Then, of course, you'll add text and images to your ad, which we'll go through in a moment. You'll add the call to action, which is the button and the link, meaning where you send people from your ad, whether that's to a Qualtrics survey, a website, or a messenger conversation. And then finally, you can have Facebook optimize your ads for your desired outcome. So for many of us, that's probably going to be completed surveys, and we'll talk about how you do that in a moment. Okay. So to set up the campaign, you first need to set up an objective. So that means, are you trying to get conversions, which we can define in multiple different ways. For businesses, this is often like people buying something on their website. For us, we can define it as completing a survey. I honestly don't have a great sense of how much it matters what you choose at this stage. Often, I think for our messenger survey, we did engagement, maybe messages actually. But I think if you want to create a pixel and have Facebook optimize for completed surveys, you want to choose conversions. So then you'll, after setting up the campaign level, get into the ad set level. And so here is where you define conversion, budget and schedule, and your audience. And so here you can see that we've clicked going to a website as the sort of conversion event we want to optimize. We've set our daily budget at $150. Facebook gives these estimated daily click rates. I honestly have not paid much attention to these, mostly because before you run any kind of survey, it's really hard to estimate what kind of click-through rate you're going to get. So Facebook can maybe estimate how many clicks you'll get, but depending on what your ad says and what your survey is like, people will click the ad and then be like, I don't know what this survey is, or you're showing me informed consent, like, I don't know what that is, I don't want to participate. And then you'll, have a much smaller click-through rate. So I don't pay too much attention to this. Again, what I want to highlight is creating this daily budget rather than any kind of lifetime budget. And here's where you sort of set your start date. You can set an end date if you want. I usually just do it sort of manually, where I'll turn everything off when I've hit my target sample size. And then after you set the budget, you set the audience. And so this is where you do any kind of targeting. So you can create your location. This can be a country. I will say that it's not at all standardized across locations what kind of unit you can target. So for instance, in Kenya, Facebook still uses the old regions and does not have county level targets that you can use. So you can't target people in a particular county. You can use GPS location, but it's a little bit of a like, see what you can get, like trial and error kind of thing to see what kinds of geographic units you can use in your location of interest. You can do age, gender, and then there's a bunch more different categories like interests. In my experience, I think these are, as most of Facebook targeting is catered to the US context. So there's a lot more targeting you can do based on interests and affiliations in the US than outside of the US. Similarly, education levels in Facebook are based on the US model. So for instance, in our Kenya-Mexico survey, in Kenya, we realized, after a pilot that we were getting much more educated people than we should if this was trying to be as close to a nationally representative sample as we could get. And so then we tried to target people who were less educated, but that's challenging because the education levels are like high school. And so it's unclear if people in Kenya, where high school doesn't really exist, would show up if we targeted people in high school. We ended up targeting people who did not have an education level set, and I don't think that worked at all. So it's particularly hard to target based on education in my experience. Okay. So after you get all your sort of conversion, goals, budget, schedule, audience set, then you obviously need to create the ad. And so there's a bunch of different text that goes in here. There's the primary text, the headline, and the description. You can see where these things show up. So the headline here, the link to the Qualtrics, the call to action button, and then the primary text above. And what's nice is that Facebook will give you a sample of what your ad will look like on various platforms. So on Timeline, on Messenger, Instagram, all of these things. So I will say that it's much more of an art than a science in developing these ads. And I'm by no means a marketing PR expert. But I will say that images work better than more text. Like I think we could have removed this text that we added over the image. And I do think that, there's evidence actually that the image matters a lot. So this is a study by researchers at Northeastern where they targeted an ad or several ads to the same target audience or population. And so the base had sort of no image, no text, but the links were different. So whether it went to a bodybuilding site or a cosmetic site, then they added text. Similarly, they're still targeting the same people, but adding text doesn't do much. Adding a headline does a little bit more to say like the target is going to be more or less men that Facebook's algorithm sends the same ad targeting the same people to. But then once you add the image, so the image was, beauty, makeup versus a bodybuilder, then you see this really big disparity in the fraction of men in the same audience. Again, they were not targeting by gender, they were targeting, overall. But once you added an image, Facebook's algorithm says, okay, this image is going to do better among men or women, and then we'll start targeting your ad that way. So this is all to say that, forgetting about the normative implications of this study, the image that you select for the ad can matter a lot. I'm just going to pause there for any questions. Okay, so you might want to keep track of which ads respondents come from. Again, I would emphasize that it's important to sort of ask in the survey, in addition to using whatever sort of tags Facebook gives you for respondents, because these things are not perfect in terms of how they estimate gender, age, education, whatever it is. So one way you can do this is when you set up your ad, there's a tracking section, and you can add URL parameters. So there's a bunch of, like if you just Google adding URL parameters to a Facebook ad, there's a bunch of resources there. So I'm not going to go too much into the nitty gritty, but just to signal that this is one way that you can add a sort of tag for each ad you create. So here I'm saying this is from the Tanzania country ad and the language is Swahili. And so then if you're doing a Qualtrics survey, you can add this as an embedded variable. So you can track which respondents in your survey come from which ad. And so you can imagine that this would be useful not only for sort of knowing where people come from or which ads are performing best, but also if you wanted to implement any kind of flow or randomization based on your ads, right? So if you wanted to, I don't know, send people from Tanzania to one version of the Qualtrics survey, people from Kenya to a different version of the Qualtrics survey, this would be one way to automate that without asking people first where they're coming from. And again, I would caution that you should ask people if the variable of interest is something that's particularly hard to estimate, age or even gender. But if it's something like country, I think, at least in my experience, Facebook does a good job of knowing which country people live in. But anything at the sort of subnational unit becomes a little bit trickier. Okay, so then you might also want to think about tracking conversions. And so here I'll talk about completed surveys with a Facebook pixel. So this is a really nice feature of Facebook. Again, when you're setting up the ads, there's this optimization and delivery section, and you can optimize for link clicks, which would be, I think, the second best thing to do if you didn't want to set up a pixel or for whatever reason, if you couldn't add this to your survey. But if you can, then you want to optimize for conversions. And what you do is you set up a Facebook pixel. Again, I'm not going to go into the details of how to do that, but it's very Googleable. And what that means is it's just a sort of snippet of code that Facebook uses to track who gets to that page. So here I'm showing you from my Qualtrics survey. So this was like the last question where I ask if anyone has any other comments from the survey. You can add JavaScript in Qualtrics, and then this pops up and you just paste in this snippet of code where Facebook then can track who gets to this page. So what that means is using this pixel, Facebook then knows which respondents or which people from which ads are getting to the end of the survey. So not just optimizing for who clicks on the ad or starts the ad, but depending on where you put this pixel, actually optimizing the ads for people that complete the survey. Yes.
I don't know if this is an option with Facebook, but I feel like with email, like can users basically opt out of being tracked with pixels, and would that create some sort of issue with the information you have about conversions?
That's a good question. I don't know if you can opt out of being tracked with a pixel. I would have to look that up.
Okay. I think I've heard that for like Gmail email marketing, and so I don't know if that's the case for Facebook as well, but
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I'm not sure. Okay. So then once you've sort of set up your ads, what does this actually look like? So this is the ads manager page on Facebook where you'll see your campaigns, your ad sets, and then your ads. And you can customize what you view here. So the bidding strategy, here I'm, optimizing and paying for conversions versus link clicks, the results. So again, what's nice is that if you do use this pixel and you sort of optimize for conversions, which I've called completed surveys here, you can see results in each of your ad sets. And then if you clicked on the ads tab for each ad, so this is a good way to monitor how many people are coming in from each of your ads. Similarly, you can see, how much you're spending, the cost per result. And if you don't give Facebook a sort of result or conversion that you're optimizing for, they'll show you cost per clicks or cost per impressions. But often that can be misleading if what we care about is completed surveys rather than clicks. So there's one thing I want to highlight, which is that in this ads manager view, so when you're looking at your different ads, if you did want to sort of replicate one standard template of an ad and then sort of just change a minimal thing, whether that's the type of people that are being targeted or the location, it can be quite cumbersome to do that for, let's say, hundreds of ads by like going into edit and then trying to copy and then changing the things manually. A slightly easier way to do this is to click this button that allows you to create a couple ads, like a handful, and then export these into a CSV or Excel. And then you can see all of the different variables that Facebook is using in these ads, and you can manually change them. So for instance, if you had, if you wanted to do 100 different GPS locations, what I would do is I would basically create one ad that looks exactly the way you want it to look like for all of them, export the table, and then here would be where I would sort of manually copy paste the GPS location for the rest of the 100 rather than doing it in the Facebook side of things. I will caveat and warn that this can be quite finicky. So for instance, I've done it where I've downloaded the CSV and then immediately tried to upload it and have those ads work without changing anything, and Facebook gives me an error. So it's not a foolproof method by any stretch of the imagination. So I would sort of play around with it and change a couple things initially, try and upload it, make sure it works, re-download, do it again, just to make sure that you're not running into any issues. Okay. So here are a couple questions that I get asked a lot, and I'd be very keen to sort of hear from all of you if there are any other questions you have. So the first is how to estimate ad costs, which is unfortunately a really hard question for the reasons that we've talked about previously. So I think the best way is to just run a pilot with your survey, your ads, your targeting strategy. The second best way would be to try and estimate costs based on other researchers, ideally in similar contexts, but again, depending on the time of the year, what kind of targeting strategy you're using, the incentives you're using or not using, survey length, all of these things are some sort of complicated function to input into the actual ad costs. So it can be a little bit tricky. So if you can, I would recommend running a pilot to estimate costs. Second question you might have is survey mode. Should it be Qualtrics or should it be a chatbot in the sort of messenger app? And so a quick answer is that Qualtrics is better for complicated flows and randomizations. At least Chatfuel, which I've used to program the messenger bot, is much more clunky. It can do all of the things that Qualtrics can do, but in my experience, the user interface is not at all as nice. What's nice about the messenger bot is if you want to create a panel, it is super easy to recontact people. It's also really easy if people attrit and leave your survey, stop answering questions. For instance, in our misinformation study, we wanted to make sure that even if you left the survey, we could still debrief you and tell you which pieces of information you saw were untrue. And this is really easy in the messenger bot. So I would say if you're doing any kind of panel, the messenger app might be the way to go. Third might be whether you want to include survey incentives or not. It's definitely quicker to get respondents this way. The downside might be that if you're offering a really nice incentive, people will start sharing the ads, and that may or may not be problematic depending on what kind of sample you're looking for. In my experience, I've tried to run one unincentivized survey on Facebook in Kenya, Uganda, and Nigeria, and it totally failed. Like, got 40 respondents total after running it for at least a day. So in my experience, incentivized surveys work a lot better, though. I mean, a colleague of mine ran an unincentivized chatbot messenger survey in the Philippines during COVID and got, a sample size of 5,000, and it was unincentivized. It was also a super short survey. So it depends on sort of the makeup of a lot of these decisions. And then the second thing, or the last thing I will add is a quick tip to add screeners if you're thinking about including an image or video treatment, whether that's on Qualtrics or in a messenger survey. So the way we did this in our latest messenger survey is we posted a photo of, in this case, a chicken, and we asked people to say what the photo is of. And as you can see from these responses, so this was, a multiple choice. We gave people buttons. You can see that some people cannot see the image. And why we screen people out at this stage, this was at the beginning of the survey, is because all of our treatments were images or videos. And so we wanted to make sure that people had a phone or a tool to take the survey that would allow them to view these images and videos. And so we wanted to screen out people for data reasons or phone capability reasons, or in this case, someone was using the free version of Facebook, in which case it's sort of like the basic HTML. So we wanted to make sure that these people would not be taking our full survey. So finally, a couple challenges, I think some of which have been already highlighted. One, in terms of targeting, again, geographic units are not standardized. The Facebook categories and variables were very much created with the US system in mind, which can be challenging. And Facebook estimates in terms of link clicks costs are often very wrong, so I would pay very little attention to those. The other thing is sort of bad actors, which we run into in any kind of survey, I think. I've had people try to take the survey multiple times. I've had people, I think, create fake Facebook pages to take the survey multiple times, which is, actually quite impressive. But it's just something to be aware of. And then finally, paying respondents, we didn't talk that much about. I've recently come across Africa's Talking, which is a great way to sort of automate payments or incentives in the form of airtime in some of the countries that I've run these surveys. And I have a GitHub repo that I'll make public soon with code to work with their API to do that. And then finally, the challenge of running these surveys, so much different than it would be if we were doing things on the ground in the field, is that rather than actually talking to people, you're just moderating comments. So often, people will think it's a scam, rightfully so, be skeptical of these kinds of things. I posted this here, which is a conversation fully among respondents, sort of arbitrating each other, saying, like, one person saying it's a scam, other people saying it's not a scam, I got paid. So sometimes you can sort of let it work itself out. Where you really need to be paying attention and to moderate is when people start spamming your ads. So, right, you're taking out an ad, you're paying to target people. And so if people comment on that ad, it's being sent to all of the people your ad is being sent to. So people would add links about Bitcoin, get rich quick schemes or whatever it is. So you can sort of go and delete those comments. You can at worse, sort of ban people from your page if you need to, but it's just something to be aware of when you're using these ads.
Do you ever engage more directly, like respond to those comments and be like, this is not a scam, or like, I don't know what you would even say.
Sometimes. So I think I've done a bunch of different strategies. This was my favorite strategy, whereas it's like, I don't have to do anything. Other people are sort of speaking up for the survey with their own evidence, which I think speaks a lot stronger than, the Facebook page itself saying this is not a scam. I often, if no one's sort of responding to it, I hide the comment or I delete the comment. Sometimes, again, with these payment systems, like things happen, errors happen. So sometimes people don't get paid and then they comment on the ad and say, I took the survey 3 days ago, I haven't gotten my airtime, where's my airtime? And then I respond to people and say, send me, send a direct message, like I'll look it up, or the issue has been resolved, you should be paid in 24 hours. And I leave that public just to make sure people know that I'm being responsive and coming to these issues. But yeah, I don't have a surefire way to deal with the scam problem. So quickly, you know, as I said, the design of these ads, I think, is much more an art than a science. And there's a bunch of challenges, but I think overall these ads are quick and definitely relatively cheap to recruit diverse respondents in many contexts. And they can provide quality data, especially if you're mainly concerned with internal validity rather than trying to get any kind of, you know, close to representative sample. So I will end there and happy to answer any other questions.
I guess just one more question. Have there been limits in just practically like the types of questions that you're able to use these surveys for? Or like, I don't know, it seems to work well if you're collecting basic data. And then also, I guess, going back to the issue of like internal validity and just making sure that participants are like engaging to the level that you want them to and giving responses that make sense, and not just like doing it as quickly and flipping through to get their airtime. How do you have any way of testing for that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we've used a bunch of attention checks to try and verify that people are paying attention and reading the question. Often I've, you know, copy pasted what other scholars, in particular Adam Berinsky and others, have run in US contexts. Those I think need to be adapted a bit for whatever local context you're working in. So he's got one question that's like, you know, we're interested in understanding what kinds of like news sources people use. Please actually ignore this question. It's to make sure you're paying attention and just like add K, the letter K in the other like specify section. And I think even people who are reading that, if you're not used to taking surveys and like understanding that that's an attention check, that comes off really weird. So I do recommend having some kind of attention check. I think in a sort of range from easy to hard. So for easy, we ask people to re-enter their age. So we want to make sure, one, that they're sort of not lying about their age so that the two age questions match, and that they're paying attention. And then including some more complicated things like pretending to write a question, but then saying, oh, please just actually ignore this question and select whatever answer. But it needs to be a little bit more explained for people who aren't used to those kinds of attention checks. But I think those are necessary in addition to any kind of screeners you want to do to make sure people can view the things that you're sending to them, to make sure people are engaged. Sorry, your first question, are you talking about research questions or survey questions?
Survey questions.
So, I mean, all of these studies were covered by IRB. Obviously, there's going to be things you can't ask based on ethics approvals.
Okay, actually, maybe I partially do mean research question. I guess, like, are there limits in where you've found that you're able to apply this method and get useful results to help you like answer whatever problem?
Yeah.
Like, are there times when you just have to go do it in person? Or
yeah, I think there are, I mean, yes, there are absolutely going to be times where you just have to do something in person. I guess I've sort of made that decision prior to running the Facebook experiment. So in all of these cases, I sort of asked that first question, like, is Facebook a good tool to answer this question? Are people on social media the kinds of people I care about getting and understanding how they respond to this treatment or whatever it is? So these studies that I presented sort of passed that first stage selection criteria. But there's absolutely research questions that are not amenable to research on Facebook. For instance, if you're interested in people who can't self-administer a survey because they can't read or they can't read in the language that you're doing the survey in, maybe you want to, I mean, in the Kenya, Mexico study, we did the Kenya survey in 5 different languages. So that helped with access a little bit. But again, there's going to be people who won't click to take a survey, but then also can't sort of read the survey and do it well. So depending on your population of interest and your research question, I think it's It's more about thinking about whether social media users are the kinds of people that you're interested in or not.
We have 2 hands.
Yeah, Rory.
Hi, Leah. Thank you so much for the presentation. It's made the methodology of using Facebook a lot more approachable. It was very intimidating to me before today, and now I'm like, oh, I think I can actually do this. So you kind of already answered like my first question, because I'm thinking about doing a survey here in South Africa, which is multilingual. And so my question was going to be about, like, I had seen that your ad that you showed was in Swahili, and then like the cost benefit of like also having the whole Qualtrics survey be in different languages and how that worked out. And like my second question was also like, when you did the Kenya and Tanzania studies, so for multi-country studies, would you suggest that we run them concurrently, or that like do one first and then another, just basically on your, what you would recommend on those 2 fronts?
Yeah, great questions. In terms of language, so I think this is in the paper. I don't remember off the top of my head. In terms of the Kenya survey, like how many people took it in Kikuyu, Luo, Somali, all of that. I think it was a pretty small minority, but yes, we did, so here we're signaling that you can take the survey in these different languages, even though we're then using English and Swahili on the ad. So we made the decision to translate the full Qualtrics survey into these languages because they're the most commonly spoken languages in Kenya. And we were trying to like give it the best shot of getting as close to a nationally representative, or at least pretty diverse sample as we could. So I think it depends, right? So if your research question and your design is mostly about internal validity, you care about administering some treatment, seeing what kind of effects it has on a sample, and you don't particularly care what that sample looks like, then that might lead you down one path or the other in terms of investing in translating the full survey into multiple languages or not. I mean, if your research question was, hinged on heterogeneous treatment effects across these different subgroups that all spoke different languages, then yes, then that would lead you to probably want to translate the full survey and maybe even have different ad versions in each different language. What's nice about Facebook is that you can have it you can give it a bunch of different ad options, even in the same ad, and it will optimize. That can be good and bad, right? But so presumably if in language A, it was getting a certain type of people, it would keep showing that language ad to those people, whereas in language B, it would show to a different set of people. It's something you probably just want to play around with. So I would think about like how much language is important in terms of getting you the sample that you want and answering the research question that you care about. In terms of the 2 countries, concurrently or not, I think it depends. So in the Kenya, Tanzania study, we were sort of using it around this football match. So timing mattered a lot and we wanted to do it concurrently. If timing doesn't really matter in your study, I could see benefits to doing one country sort of working out the kinks and then moving on to another country. It also helps in terms of like monitoring the ads, dealing with these comments and all of that. But I will say that like things happen over time, right? So if both on the platform, but also in the real world. So like if the real world things might matter, that might be a justification for doing it concurrently. On the platform side of things, depending on timing, costs could change. So that's not really an answer, but it's just sort of things to think about when making that decision about running them simultaneously or not. Yeah. Eyal?
Thanks so much. This has been super helpful. My question is about the Facebook restriction on ads on elections, politics, credit, and employment. So it's like the special ad category. Have you run into any problems with Facebook, like banning your ad page or advertisements? Because I've heard of this happening in other countries. And I guess I'm just wondering if there's ways to get around it or what strategies you took.
Yes, I still have one of my ad accounts banned or blocked. Not because I was trying to do any kind of political ad or anything, but I think, I mean, it's not humans that are evaluating these ads, right? So anytime you start, I probably should have said this during the talk, but anytime you create a campaign, ad sets ads, they go under a process of review by the platform. And that's, as best as I can tell, all automated. So algorithms read the text you're including, the images, all of that. So for whatever reason, I've had ads that were flagged as sort of not compatible with Facebook's terms of service, and then they've sort of blocked my ad account, and you can sort of appeal again through this like automated process. So it's a little bit frustrating in that you're not interacting with a human. And I've had, you know, ad accounts that are still blocked, and I've just created a new ad account. So it's just something to be aware of and bake into your research timeline as well. So you want to try and create these ads ahead of time, get them under review, and then ideally approved, you know, a couple of weeks before you're trying to start the survey in case you run into any of those problems. Obviously, if you're actually running a more sort of like straight politics survey, an ad, you're going to have many more problems. I think now like an extra checkbox that you click if you're running some kind of political campaign. But I haven't needed to check that box.
And just a quick follow-up, thanks. Did you connect these to your personal Facebook profile? Like when you created the page, or was it like a totally separate profile?
Yeah, so I create a new page, and the page is connected to my profile in that like my profile is an admin of the page, but when I'm interacting on the page with people on the ads and comments, whatever, I'm interacting as the page. So it does not say that Lee Rosenzweig is saying this is not a scam. It says that Social Impact Research Lab is saying whatever. But you do need to have a Facebook account to do anything that I've talked about today.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah.